Hi, this is Dr. Rebecca Wood, and this is our Week 7 lecture. And this week I'm titling the lecture Leaving St. Louis Behind, mostly because the three authors that we read for this week actually did leave the city behind, and also because in some ways I'd like to bid farewell to the baggage and the history and some of the tragedies that we have experienced or studied this term. And so that's why I've titled the lecture as I have. Now, as we look back to the past and review what we've studied this term, and we are looking forward to the final exam next week, and I know looking forward to might not be the correct term, but looking back to the past, we began the term with Father Jacques Marquette and his voyage on the Great Mississippi River, a muddy river surrounded by wild nature and the people who lived on the land, and he tried to get to know the people, and he smoked the calumet or the peace pipe, and was working very hard to convert the people that he met, the Native Americans, to Catholicism because he believed that was his mission in life. And he also gave us that wonderful description of the piasaw bird from his work. Also, we studied Lewis and Clark and their expedition, and I think of it as the beginning maybe of the United States as we know it, and also the end of the Native American population in many, many ways. It was a big change to our country, and their expedition helped bring that change about. And when they did their expedition, the once thriving civilization of the Cahokians, and remember we had the video of the Cahokia civilization, was gone long before Meriwether Lewis and William Clark explored the expanse of the Louisiana Purchase. It took them 2 years, and as you recall, everybody thought they had died, and they were really surprised when Lewis and Clark returned. Lewis died not long after the expedition, and they think he may have committed suicide, and Clark stayed in Missouri, eventually becoming the governor of the Missouri Territory, so he did quite well for himself. And then, as St. Louis grew along with the rest of the United States and became the gateway to the West, visitors and residents witnessed the injustices of slavery and the displacement of the Native American population. So the world was changing, but in this situation, not in the best ways for everyone, obviously. We studied William Wells Brown, who wrote that no part of our slaveholding country is more noted for the barbarity of its inhabitants than St. Louis. And I know some of you wrote about that on the discussion board and how that was a stunning sentence, and his entire excerpt was stunning in many ways. And then Charles Dickens, as I mentioned, is one of my favorite writers of all time, noticed in his writings about his 1842 visit to the U.S. that he met a Choctaw chief, and when he spoke to him, he learned that there were but 20,000 of the Choctaws left, and their number was decreasing every day. So Charles Dickens did note that he was paying attention and that the Native American population was being decimated. Then also, the changing city and a changing nation. St. Louis, as we have discussed, has been the subject of that question, what's the matter with St. Louis? And I don't know if this slide is in some ways symbolic of that. We have on the left William Tecumseh Sherman, who helped win the Civil War for the Union. St. Louis was very divided, as you recall, about slavery and the Civil War, and there was great cost and sacrifice, and also Sherman is considered a hero by those who were on the Union side, and if you go down south, you will find that he is not considered a hero by many people, even to this day. And then Logan Uriah Rivas and his wife tried to promote St. Louis to be the capital of our nation, but failed. And then we learned very recently about the East St. Louis riot, which was shocking and depressing, and the unbelievable cruelty and sheer evil were reported by Carlos Hurd of the St. Louis Post-Dispatch. And I must say that we've seen things from the Post-Dispatch all the way through this term, and there's a picture from the Post-Dispatch archives on this slide. And I believe that journalists and journalism are part of history and help make history. And so I'm a firm believer in the need for our press. And when we read about Carlos Hurd's experiences during the East St. Louis riot, we heard that he put his life on the line to report what was happening and even tried to save some victims of the riot, although he unfortunately was unable to do so. And then we also read W.E.B. Du Bois' investigation of what happened during the riot and its aftermath, trying to gain some understanding of what happened in his book of Work and Wealth. And we also noted the beauty of his writing style as we studied his work. And now we're looking for a future. Is it a good future, a bad future? Are we also able to participate in making that future for St. Louis, or if you're not in St. Louis, the city where you reside now? And so we're looking at some new authors and hopefully a new era, although these authors did not stay in St. Louis, so perhaps they are not really going to be the harbingers of a new era. But our first author is T.S. Eliot. Also, his real name was Thomas Stearns Eliot. And he was born in St. Louis, and his family founded both Mary Institute and Washington University, one of our competitors. And then he went on to Harvard and then lived the rest of his life in England. His work is densely populated by ideas, imagination, big words, and allusions to writers of all eras, and he is considered to be one of the greatest English language poets ever. In our excerpt from one of his works this week, he writes that, quote, "I do not know much about gods, but I think that the river is a strong brown god, sullen, untamed, and intractable." So he loved to bring in nature, and also he had some very interesting religious ideas. I'm not sure we ever could figure out exactly what his religious affiliation would be. And then his most revered work is The Wasteland, which I regret we do not have time to study this term. It's a poem that begins with one of the most famous lines in literature. So if you ever hear anybody joking around and they say, "April is the cruelest month," that is a quote from T.S. Eliot. And so he wrote in that poem, quote, "April is the cruelest month, breeding lilacs out of the dead land, mixing memory and desire, stirring dull roots with spring rain." And this line is in itself an allusion or a reference back to Geoffrey Chaucer's Canterbury Tales, which book begins with a much happier vision of the meaning of the month of April. So it's kind of like he was arguing with an old poet when he wrote those lines, which is kind of fun if you like analyzing things and trying to figure out just what Eliot was trying to do and to whom he was alluding in his poetry. And then this week we also have Maya Angelou, and she was born Marguerite Annie Johnson, but spent most of her life other places. She was also the poet who read at Bill Clinton's inauguration, so she's done some very amazing things in her life. She wrote many poems and books, including her autobiography, I Know Why the Caged Bird Sings, in which she described her family, and of course that is part of our reading assignment this week. And this is a quote from that reading assignment, which I enjoyed very much and wanted to read out loud because I love reading the works of our authors out loud, even if it's just to myself. And she wrote, "While we sat on the stiff wooden booths, Mother would dance alone in front of us to music from the Seeburg. I loved her most at those times. She was like a pretty kite that floated just above my head." And so we might analyze that and wonder, why was her mother like a kite, her vision of her mother so far above her and unattainable? And we could analyze her poetry and what that meant, or her essay, and wonder what that meant. And also, we this week have work by Tennessee Williams, and I have a little tiny story to tell about Tennessee Williams. I met his brother Dakin once back in the past, and Dakin was quite a character himself. And from what I understand, Tennessee Williams was possibly twice the character that his brother was. So they were a very interesting family. And Thomas Lanier Williams was born in Columbus, Mississippi, but then moved to St. Louis. And he did not want to be buried here in St. Louis, but his brother Dakin, from what I read somewhere, said that he would bury him here anyway, and he did. And so Tennessee Williams' mother, sister, and himself are all buried in Calvary Cemetery in St. Louis. Uh, Tennessee Williams went to University City High School, the University of Missouri Columbia, and then Washington University, but he didn't graduate from either Columbia or Washington University. He worked at International Shoe when he lived in St. Louis, and I don't think he was very happy working there. And many people think that that the Glass Menagerie is based on his time working at International Shoe, where he was not very happy. Tennessee Williams wrote many plays as well as some early poetry. One of his best known plays, A Streetcar Named Desire, is being produced this summer. And so here's the poster. You could actually see if there are tickets available and go see a Tennessee Williams play on the stage. I've seen A Streetcar Named Desire, and it's quite the experience. And also, if you're interested, there is a Stella shouting contest. And so if you've ever seen that little snippet of Marlon Brando yelling Stella, then that's what that's all about, and that's from the play A Streetcar Named Desire. So we have a lot to think about this week, and I hope you enjoy your reading assignments, and I'm looking forward to reading your papers, and I hope you have a wonderful week. Thank you.